Some corporate scandals explode overnight. Others disappear quietly. No perp walks, no public trials, no executive apologies on camera. Just silence. And silence, when it comes from power, is never accidental. Today's file is about one of the largest corporate collapses in human history. A collapse so big it threatened the global economy, yet so controlled that many people barely noticed. This is the corporate file on China Evergrande Group, and how a trillion-dollar illusion was built, hidden, and then buried. The dream machine. Evergrande didn't just sell apartments, it sold aspiration. To millions of Chinese families, home ownership wasn't an investment. It was stability, status, security. Evergrande promised all of it, faster, bigger, everywhere. Entire cities rose from empty land, glass towers, luxury ads, perfectly staged showrooms. The scale was staggering. At its height, Evergrande had over 1,300 projects across more than 280 cities. Construction cranes dominated skylines. Sales centers gleamed with marble and promise. The marketing was relentless. Glossy brochures, celebrity endorsements, aspirational messaging that spoke to a generation desperate to claim their piece of China's economic miracle. For families saving for years, buying an Evergrande apartment meant joining the middle class. It meant their children would have stability. At its peak, Evergrande employed hundreds of thousands directly and supported millions indirectly. Banks trusted it. Suppliers depended on it. Local governments needed it. And that dependency was its real power. Because when everyone needs you to succeed, warning signs get ignored, questions get postponed, problems get rationalized. Evergrande wasn't just a company, it was infrastructure, employment, tax revenue, and economic growth packaged into one massive entity. And that made it untouchable until it wasn't. Debt as a business model. Behind the polished billboards was a dangerous reality. Evergrande wasn't growing on profits, it was growing on debt. Borrow from banks, borrow from investors, borrow from customers before buildings were finished. Then use that money to buy more land, to borrow more money, to promise more projects. This is the pre-sale model. Customers pay upfront for apartments that won't be completed for years. That cash funds current construction and future land acquisitions. It works as long as prices rise, as long as confidence holds, as long as the next project brings in enough cash to finish the last one. But it's not sustainable. It's a cycle that requires constant acceleration. By 2020, Evergrande's liabilities exceeded $300 billion. Its debt obligations touched banks, bondholders, suppliers, homebuyers, and employees. Internally, this wasn't ignorance, it was strategy. Financial engineering replaced financial discipline. Leverage became the primary tool. Risk was distributed so widely that failure seemed impossible. Because who would let something this big collapse? Confidence wasn't optional, it was mandatory. Executives knew the numbers, they knew the exposure, they knew the risks were mounting, but admitting that meant triggering the very panic they were trying to avoid. So they projected strength while scrambling internally to keep the machine running. Because the moment confidence cracked, the entire structure would collapse. And for years, confidence held. The fake confidence loop. Even as liabilities ballooned into hundreds of billions, Evergrande projected strength. Executives reassured markets. State-linked media avoided alarm. Construction sites stayed visually active even when funding dried up. This wasn't transparency, it was theater. Annual reports emphasized scale and ambition. Press releases announced new projects. Leadership appeared at industry events projecting calm authority. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the reality was darkening. Employees were encouraged to invest their savings into company wealth management products. Told it was safe. Told it showed loyalty. Those products were paying earlier investors with money from new investors. A classic cycle that only works until it stops. Suppliers were paid with property promises instead of cash. They received apartments or commercial units they'd have to sell themselves to get liquidity. Contractors were pressured to continue work with promises of future payment. Some kept building, hoping the money would eventually come. Confidence became currency, and in a system where panic is more dangerous than debt, the illusion was protected. Regulators saw the numbers. They understood the systemic risk. But public acknowledgement would trigger the crisis they were trying to prevent. So the approach was quiet pressure, unofficial guidance, attempts to engineer a soft landing without causing market panic. Evergrande was told to reduce debt, to slow acquisitions. But slowing down meant revealing the underlying weakness. It meant admitting the growth was unsustainable. And admission in this context was unthinkable. When reality arrived. Eventually, math wins. Payments were missed. First to international bondholders, then to domestic suppliers, then to employees. Projects stalled. Construction stopped mid-build. Cranes sat motionless against unfinished towers. Home buyers protested. Families who had paid their life savings stood outside empty buildings demanding answers. Images leaked of unfinished buildings, hollow concrete skeletons where futures were supposed to be. International investors panicked. Bond prices collapsed. Credit ratings were slashed. Domestic messaging stayed calm. Here's the key difference. In many countries, collapse is loud. Media swarms, politicians grandstand. In China, collapse is managed. Executives vanished from public view. Founder Hui Ka-yan, once among China's wealthiest individuals, retreated from the spotlight. Information slowed. Financial disclosures became sporadic. Responsibility diffused. No single moment of failure, no clear villain, just controlled decay. Evergrande technically defaulted, but default was never officially declared. Obligations were restructured. Payments were delayed. Language softened the reality. Because in a centralized information environment, the narrative matters as much as the facts. The goal wasn't to deny the problem, it was to prevent panic from amplifying it. The state steps in quietly. Evergrande was too big to fail, but also too big to publicly save. A full bailout would set a dangerous precedent. It would signal that excessive risk-taking would always be rescued. So the response was surgical. Projects were reassigned. Viable developments were transferred to healthier developers. Unfinished buildings got new funding, but not from Evergrande. Banks were protected first. State-owned financial institutions couldn't be allowed to fail. Home buyers came later. Efforts were made to complete projects, but timelines stretched. Foreign investors? Last. International bondholders were told to wait. Restructuring negotiations dragged on. This wasn't a bailout in the Western sense. It was containment. The goal wasn't justice or making investors whole, it was stability. Because in centralized systems, the biggest threat isn't failure, it's loss of control. A disorderly collapse could trigger runs on other developers. Panic could spread to the banking system. So control was maintained through selective information and quiet redistribution of assets. The system absorbed the failure without acknowledging its full scale. Who paid the price? Let's be clear about the cost. Not executives, not regulators, not the system. The cost was paid by families who prepaid for homes that never arrived. Life savings locked in concrete shells. Workers owed months of wages, construction crews, cleaners, security staff who couldn't afford to wait. Small suppliers crushed by unpaid contracts. Local businesses that went under themselves. Employees who invested their savings in company wealth management products. Retirement funds vanished. Evergrande didn't just collapse financially, it collapsed socially. Weddings were postponed because apartments weren't ready. Families stayed in cramped quarters waiting for homes they'd already paid for. The human cost was enormous, but it was diffused across millions of people, none with enough individual power to demand accountability. And that diffusion made it manageable for the system. But the story faded, because when information is controlled, outrage has an expiration date. Social media posts were moderated, protests were dispersed, media coverage shifted. Not through dramatic censorship, but through gentle redirection at time. Why this story matters. Evergrande isn't just a Chinese story, it's a global warning. When growth is rewarded without accountability, when debt is disguised as success, and when power decides which truths are allowed, collapse doesn't disappear. It just happens quietly. Evergrande grew because growth was celebrated, because bigger meant successful, because leverage was seen as sophistication rather than risk. It survived scrutiny for years because acknowledging the problem was more threatening than ignoring it. And when it finally failed, the response prioritized stability over justice. This pattern isn't unique. Different countries manage it differently, but the core dynamic repeats. Too big to fail becomes too big to prosecute. Systemic risk becomes an excuse for protecting the powerful. The families who paid for apartments that never came aren't getting their money back. The suppliers who extended credit won't be made whole. But the system survived, the banks stabilized, the contagion was contained. And that's considered success. Silence in corporate history is often the loudest evidence of all. Because the stories that disappear, the scandals that fade without resolution, those reveal how power actually works. Not through dramatic confrontations, but through quiet management. Not through transparency, but through controlled information. Evergrande was built on an unsustainable model. It enriched executives during the boom. It employed millions and housed millions more. And when it collapsed, the pain was distributed to those least able to absorb it, while the system that enabled it remained largely intact. This was World Corporate Files. And this story wasn't forgotten, it was buried. When confidence replaces transparency, collapse becomes inevitable. If this investigation revealed how power operates when the cameras aren't watching, subscribe to World Corporate Files. Because the next case is already unfolding in a different country with a different name, following the same pattern.